You see, the moment you stopped chasing, everything changed, but not in the way most people expect. On the surface, it looked like distance. It looked like you were pulling away, maybe even giving up. But psychologically, something far more powerful was happening beneath that silence. Avoidant individuals are not emotionless. They are emotionally guarded. Their entire relational pattern is built around one core belief: closeness equals risk. So when someone pursues them too intensely, even with love, even with good intentions, their instinct is to retreat, not because they don't care, but because they care in a way that feels overwhelming and unfamiliar. So when you were chasing, texting first, over-explaining, trying to fix the connection, you were unintentionally feeding their avoidance. You were making it easy for them to stay in control, to stay distant, to take your presence for granted, because in their mind, there was no risk of losing you. And without the risk of loss, there is no urgency to feel. But the moment you stopped, the dynamic flipped. When you pulled your energy back, not in anger, not in manipulation, but in self-respect, you created something avoidants are not used to: uncertainty. And uncertainty is the one thing they cannot emotionally regulate as easily as distance. Because now they don't know where they stand with you. They don't know if you're still available. They don't know if they still have access to your energy. And that's when something very human kicks in: the fear of loss. Loss is a powerful emotional trigger. It bypasses logic and goes straight to the core of attachment. Suddenly, the same person who seemed distant starts remembering your conversations, your presence, your energy. They begin to replay moments they once dismissed. Why? Because the brain is wired to assign more value to what feels like it's slipping away. This is not a game. This is not about manipulation. This is about restoring emotional balance. When you stopped chasing, you also stopped overgiving. You stopped proving your worth to someone who wasn't meeting you halfway. And in doing so, you shifted the power dynamic, not by controlling them, but by reclaiming yourself. Now here's the deeper layer most people miss. Your absence didn't create their feelings. It revealed them. Those emotions were always there, buried under layers of defense, distraction, and emotional avoidance. But your constant presence was allowing them to suppress it. The moment you stepped back, you removed the distraction. You removed the comfort of predictability. And what was left was raw, unprocessed emotion. And for an avoidant, that can feel intense, almost disorienting. Because now, they're not reacting to your pressure. They're responding to their own feelings. And that's a space they don't often sit in, so they start to lean in, slowly, carefully, sometimes indirectly, because they're trying to make sense of what they're feeling without losing control. But make no mistake, that pull you notice, that shift in their energy, that's not coincidence. That's emotional activation. All because you made one powerful decision. You stopped chasing. You chose self-respect over validation. You chose space over pressure. And in doing so, you triggered the one thing that awakens an avoidant's deepest emotions: the possibility of losing someone who truly mattered. And here's the truth you need to hold on to. When you stop chasing, you don't lose connection. You reveal who's willing to step forward and meet you there. And as that shift begins to take place, when you stop chasing, something even deeper starts to emerge within you. It's not just about creating distance. It's about what you replace that energy with. Because the real transformation isn't in your absence. It's in your alignment. You became emotionally self-sufficient. Now, let's be clear about what that actually means, because a lot of people misunderstand this concept. Emotional self-sufficiency is not detachment in the sense of shutting down. It's not pretending you don't care. It's not building walls. It's the ability to feel deeply without needing someone else to stabilize those feelings for you. Before this shift, your emotional state may have been tied to their behavior. If they texted, you felt secure. If they pulled away, you felt anxious. If they showed affection, you felt valued. And without realizing it, you handed them the power to regulate your inner world. But the moment you turned inward, when you stopped seeking constant reassurance and started grounding yourself, you broke that pattern. You no longer needed their attention to feel worthy. You no longer relied on their presence to feel complete. And that kind of energy is profoundly disruptive to an avoidant, because avoidants are accustomed to a certain dynamic. They expect emotional dependence. They expect the other person to lean in more, to need more, to chase more. That dynamic gives them control. It allows them to stay at a safe distance while still maintaining the connection on their terms. But when you become emotionally self-sufficient, you remove that leverage. Now they're faced with something unfamiliar, someone who wants them but doesn't need them. someone who is open but not attached, someone who can walk away without collapsing. And psychologically, this creates a shift in perceived value. Human beings are wired to respect what is stable. When someone can hold their own emotional center, it signals strength, maturity, and internal security. It communicates without words, I am whole as I am, and I choose to be here, not because I lack, but because I value. That distinction is everything, because now your presence is no longer seen as a constant. It's seen as a choice. And when something becomes a choice rather than a guarantee, it gains significance. Avoidants, despite their patterns, are still deeply perceptive. They may not express it openly, but they feel the difference. They notice when your energy is no longer reaching for them in the same way. They sense that your happiness isn't dependent on their response. And that realization does something subtle but powerful. It creates curiosity. They start to wonder, what changed? Why do they feel different? Why am I thinking about them more now? And what they're really responding to is your independence. But here's the deeper philosophical layer. Emotional self-sufficiency is not just attractive to others. It's liberating for you, because when you are no longer anchored to someone else's behavior, you regain control over your own experience. You're no longer reacting. You're choosing. You're no longer waiting. You're living. And that shift changes not only how others see you, but how you see yourself. You move from a state of lack to a state of abundance. And in that state, you don't chase connection, you attract alignment. So when an avoidant begins to lean in, it's not because you convinced them or proved your worth or said the perfect words. It's because your energy no longer demands anything from them. It invites, but it does not pressure. It's present, but it is not dependent. And that is rare, because most people are unconsciously seeking validation. But you stepped out of that cycle. You found stability within yourself. And in doing so, you became someone who doesn't just offer connection, you embody it. And that changes everything. Because at the end of the day, the strongest position you can ever stand in is this. I don't need your presence to feel whole, but I choose it when it aligns with who I am. And once you reach that level of emotional self-sufficiency, something very subtle, but incredibly powerful, begins to shape the dynamic even further. It's not what you say next. It's not what you do. It's what you stop doing. You master silence. Now, silence in most people's minds feels uncomfortable. It feels like something is wrong, like something needs to be fixed, explained, or clarified. We've been conditioned to fill gaps, to respond quickly, to maintain connection through constant communication. But silence, when it's intentional, is not absence. It's presence without pressure. And for an avoidant, that changes everything. Because they are used to noise. They are used to emotional pursuit, repeated messages, long explanations, attempts to figure things out. And all of that, even when it comes from a good place, creates a kind of emotional congestion. It gives them something to push against. It allows them to stay in their pattern of distancing because there's always something external driving the interaction. But when you go silent, not out of hurt, not out of strategy, but out of clarity, you remove that external pressure, and what's left is space. Now here's where it gets interesting psychologically. The human mind does not handle empty space well, especially when there's emotional investment involved. When there is no new input, the brain starts to generate its own. It replays past conversations. It reanalyzes moments. It fills in the gaps with meaning. So while you're grounded, focused on your life, no longer overextending your energy, they are thinking. They're remembering the way you spoke to them, the consistency you once offered, the emotional safety they didn't fully acknowledge at the time. And because there's no new interaction to distract them, those memories become louder. Silence amplifies what was previously ignored. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, this is unfamiliar territory, because now they're not reacting to your presence, they're sitting with your absence. And absence, when it's felt emotionally, has weight. It has texture. It forces reflection. This is where suppressed feelings begin to surface. You see, avoidants don't lack emotion. They delay it. They compartmentalize it. They push it aside in order to maintain control. But your silence removes the escape routes. There's no conversation to steer, no emotional demand to resist, just a quiet awareness of something missing. And that's when realization begins. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, internally, and often without them even being able to articulate it. They start to feel the impact of your absence in moments they didn't expect. A memory here, a thought there, a subtle shift in how they perceive the connection. And because you're no longer filling every space, they begin to feel the need to reach into it. Now, this doesn't always look obvious. It might not be immediate. Avoidants tend to move carefully when it comes to emotional expression, but the shift is real. The energy changes. The direction of attention changes. Because for the first time, they're not being pulled toward you. They're being drawn. And that distinction matters. Silence, when used with awareness, creates a kind of emotional gravity. It doesn't chase. It doesn't demand. It simply exists. And in that existence, it invites the other person to step forward on their own terms. But here's the deeper truth. Your silence only has power when it's backed by inner stability. If silence is used as a tactic while internally you're anxious, waiting, checking, hoping, it loses its impact. Because energy is always communicated, even without words. Real silence comes from certainty. It comes from knowing that you've said enough, done enough, and given enough. And now you allow life to respond. And that level of restraint is rare. It requires discipline. It requires self-trust. But when you embody it, you create an environment where the other person is no longer reacting to you, they're encountering themselves. And that's where real emotion begins. Because in the absence of noise, truth becomes audible. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. And as you begin to understand the power of silence, the next shift becomes even more defining, not just in how they see you, but in how you define yourself within the connection. Because silence creates space, but boundaries give that space structure. You started setting boundaries, but you did it without drama. Now, this is where most people get it wrong. When they think of boundaries, they imagine ultimatums, emotional reactions, or cutting someone off entirely. But real boundaries are not about controlling someone else's behavior. They're about clearly defining what you will and will not accept, and then aligning your actions with that standard. Before this shift, you may have tolerated inconsistency, mixed signals, delayed responses, emotional unavailability. Not because you were weak, but because you were invested. You saw potential. You believed in the connection. And in that belief, you gave more chances than you probably should have. But at some point, awareness kicked in. You realized that understanding someone's psychology doesn't mean abandoning your own needs. You recognize that empathy without standards leads to self-neglect. And that's where the change began. Instead of reacting emotionally to their distance, you responded with clarity. You stopped over-explaining how you felt. You stopped trying to convince them to meet you at your level. And most importantly, you stopped accepting less than what you knew was aligned with your values. Now here's the paradox. When you set boundaries with emotional control, you don't push an avoidant away. You actually create a framework they can respect, because avoidants are highly sensitive to pressure, but they are also deeply aware of structure. When someone communicates through behavior, "This is where I stand," it removes ambiguity. It replaces emotional chaos with clarity. And clarity, even if it's uncomfortable, feels safer than unpredictability. So when you stopped being available on demand, when you no longer entertained inconsistency, when your time, energy, and presence became conditional on mutual respect, you changed the dynamic completely. You were no longer someone they could engage with casually while keeping emotional distance. You became someone they had to show up for intentionally. And that shift activates something important: effort. Human beings value what they invest in. When something requires presence, consistency, and emotional engagement, it naturally becomes more significant. But when something is always available, always understanding, always forgiving without limit, it can unintentionally lose perceived value. Your boundaries reintroduce that value, not through force, not through manipulation, but through alignment. And what's interesting is that boundaries don't need to be loud to be effective. In fact, the strongest ones rarely are. They're expressed through decisions, not declarations, through what you allow and what you quietly step away from. You didn't argue. You adjusted. You didn't chase. You chose. And in doing so, you communicated something far more powerful than words ever could. Access to you is meaningful, and it requires presence. For an avoidant, this creates a new internal dialogue. Because now, the connection is no longer something they can maintain passively. It requires them to step out of their comfort zone, to engage, to meet you halfway. And while that may feel challenging for them, it also becomes compelling. Because deep down, avoidants don't just resist connection, they resist losing control. But when boundaries are clear and calm, there's nothing to resist. There's only a choice. Step forward or step away. And when stepping forward leads to a deeper, more grounded connection, they begin to rise to that level, even if slowly. But here's the most important part. This shift wasn't about changing them. It was about honoring yourself. Because boundaries are not a strategy to gain love. They are a standard that protects your energy, your time, and your emotional well-being. And when you live by that standard consistently, you naturally attract people who are willing to meet you there. So what you created wasn't distance. It was definition. You showed, without force, without conflict, that connection with you has depth, has structure, and has meaning. And in a world where most people are unclear, inconsistent, and emotionally reactive, that kind of clarity stands out. Because at the end of the day, people don't rise to your expectations. They rise to your standards when you're willing to uphold them. And as those boundaries become part of who you are, not something you enforce, but something you live by, another shift starts to happen. One that's even more nuanced. Because now it's not just about what you allow or don't allow. It's about how you show up while doing it. You detached. But you didn't lose your warmth. And that distinction is rare. Most people, when they begin to protect themselves, swing to extremes. They either stay overly attached, constantly available, constantly giving, or they shut down completely. They become cold, distant, emotionally inaccessible. It becomes an all-or-nothing response, driven more by past hurt than present awareness. But what you did was different. You found the middle ground. You were no longer attached to the outcome. You were no longer waiting, hoping, or needing things to go a certain way in order to feel okay. But at the same time, you didn't lose your ability to connect. You didn't become guarded to the point of disconnection. You remained open, just not dependent. And psychologically, this creates a very unique emotional environment, especially for someone with avoidant tendencies. Because avoidants are used to navigating extremes. They know how to deal with people who are overly emotional, overly available. It gives them a reason to pull back. And they know how to deal with people who are cold or distant. It allows them to stay disengaged without consequence. But your energy doesn't fit into either category. You're present, but not pursuing. You're kind, but not overextending. You're engaged, but not attached. And that balance does something subtle but powerful. It lowers their despair while increasing their curiosity. Because now, they don't feel overwhelmed by your presence. There's no pressure to respond a certain way. No expectation they feel they might fail to meet. Your detachment creates safety. It removes the emotional weight that usually triggers their instinct to withdraw. But your warmth, that's what draws them in. It's what makes the connection feel real, human, and emotionally accessible. It reminds them of what's possible without making them feel trapped by it. And this combination, safety without pressure, connection without expectation, is something they rarely experience. So instead of pulling away, they begin to lean in. Not because they're being chased, not because they're being convinced, but because for the first time, the connection feels both safe and desirable at the same time. And here's the deeper philosophical layer to understand. True detachment is not the absence of feeling. It's the absence of control. You're no longer trying to control how they feel, how they respond, or where the connection goes. You've released the need to force an outcome. And in that release, you've created space for something more authentic to emerge, because control creates resistance, but freedom invites truth. When someone feels free in your presence, they're more likely to reveal who they really are. And for an avoidant, that's everything, because their entire pattern is built around protecting themselves from emotional pressure. You removed that pressure, and what replaced it was possibility. Now, does this guarantee that they'll suddenly transform overnight? No. Avoidant patterns are deep, and real change takes time. But what you've done is create the conditions where change becomes possible, where they can move toward connection without feeling like they're losing themselves in the process. And that's what makes your presence so impactful. You're no longer trying to pull them into your world. You're simply standing in your own and allowing them to step into it if they're willing. That's power, because when you can care without clinging, when you can connect without controlling, when you can remain open without losing yourself, you become someone who doesn't just offer love. You embody emotional freedom. And that's the kind of presence people don't run from. It's the kind they slowly, quietly, and sometimes unexpectedly move closer to. And when you bring all of these shifts together, the space, the self-sufficiency, the silence, the boundaries, the balanced detachment, you become something more than just a person in their life. You become a mirror, and not just any mirror, but the kind they can't easily look away from, because up until this point, their pattern has allowed them to avoid themselves. They could stay distracted by your effort, your availability, your emotional investment. They could focus on managing the connection instead of confronting their own inner world. But now all of that has changed. You're no longer over-functioning in the dynamic. You're no longer filling the gaps they leave behind. You're no longer compensating for their inconsistency. So what happens? They're left with themselves, and that's where the real shift begins. Because when someone encounters a person who is grounded, self-aware, emotionally stable, and clear in their standards, it naturally creates contrast. Not through judgment, not through criticism, but through presence. You represent what emotional alignment looks like, and that reflection can be both inspiring and deeply uncomfortable. Because now, without you saying a word, they begin to see the difference between how you show up and how they've been showing up. They start to recognize their own patterns, the distance, the hesitation, the emotional walls. And for someone who is used to avoiding that awareness, this can feel intense. But here's the paradox. What makes it uncomfortable is also what makes it compelling. Because on some level, they don't just see your growth, they feel what it would be like to meet you there. And that feeling is unfamiliar, but powerful. It's not based on fantasy or projection. It's based on contrast. It's based on reality. You're not telling them who they should be. You're showing them what's possible through who you've become. And that kind of influence doesn't create resistance. It creates reflection. Now, will they always rise to meet that reflection? Not necessarily. Growth requires willingness, and not everyone is ready at the same time. But what you've done is plant something in their awareness that doesn't easily disappear. Because once someone sees a higher level of connection, once they feel the difference between surface interaction and genuine emotional presence, it's hard to go back to what felt normal before. You've shifted their baseline. And for an avoidant, that's significant. Because even if they pull back at times, even if they struggle with their patterns, there's now a part of them that knows there's something deeper available. There's a part of them that associates that depth with you, not just as a person, but as an experience. And that's where the phrase crazy in love starts to make sense. Not in a chaotic, obsessive way, but in a way that disrupts their internal structure. Because now their usual strategies don't work the same way. Distance doesn't feel as comfortable. Disconnection doesn't feel as satisfying. Avoidance doesn't fully protect them from what they feel. And that internal conflict creates a kind of emotional tension they can't easily resolve. Part of them wants to stay in control, but another part of them is drawn to you, drawn to the clarity, the stability, the emotional depth you embody. And that pull isn't something you forced. It's something you became. That's the real shift. You didn't change them. You evolved yourself to a level where your presence naturally invites transformation or reveals the inability to meet it. And that's where your power truly lies. Because being a mirror is not about fixing someone. It's not about waiting for them to catch up. It's about standing so firmly in your own growth that anyone who comes into your space is faced with a choice: evolve or stay where they are. And either way, you remain alive.